Imagine stepping into, say, a busy school hallway. You see this space where students have worked together, maybe painting a big, vibrant mural.
Mm-hmm.
And one child's just beaming, right? So eager to tell you about their specific brushstrokes. Meanwhile, another kid is maybe quietly helping a classmate who's struggling a bit with their art supplies. You see this real desire to help.
Yeah, that sense of community in action.
Exactly. Or picture a school cleanup day. Everyone's involved, from the little kindergartners right up to the principal picking up litter. There's this shared sense of looking after their space together.
That feeling of contributing, of, really belonging, taking pride in something bigger than just yourself.
It's powerful, isn't it? And that feeling, that connection to the community, well, that's really at the heart of what we're talking about today.
That intrinsic motivation, that drive to act for the common good, that deep sense of connection and purpose. That's precisely what we're going to explore in this deep dive.
So today, we're really digging into a fascinating and I think incredibly relevant topic, civic identity. We're going to unpack what it is, how it develops, and maybe why it's becoming such a critical idea in our, well, very interconnected world.
If you're studying elementary education, or perhaps you're just fascinated by how individuals, develop a sense of self within a community, within broader society, then this deep dive is really designed with you in mind.
Right.
Understanding civic identity is really key to figuring out how children grow into active, engaged members of their communities. It gives us some really profound insights into how we can better support young minds in feeling connected, responsible, and empowered to make a difference.
And to guide us through this, well, it's quite an intricate landscape, isn't it? Our insights today are coming from a deep exploration of a really authoritative source. It's the Handbook of Identity Theory and Research.
A major work in the field.
Definitely. And specifically, we're focusing on this pivotal chapter called Civic Identity, written by Daniel Hart, Cameron Richardson, and Britt Wilkenfeld. This academic work, it gives us a really rigorous, research-backed foundation for our whole discussion today. It pulls together, decades of thinking and actual empirical findings.
It's a very comprehensive overview.
So let's start right at the beginning, defining the core concept. When we talk about civic identity, what does that actually mean? It sounds a bit abstract, maybe.
It can, yeah. It's a good place to start grounding it.
How can we really get a handle on it?
Well, at its heart, civic identity is a central concept in both political theory and political psychology. It's probably best understood as having these subjective, ethical, and political sides to how an individual sees themselves in relation to their community, their society.
So it's not just a list of things you do.
No, exactly. It's
Yeah.
more of an internal framework, a way of seeing yourself.
So it's not just what you do, civically speaking, but how you feel about doing it and maybe who you believe you are in that context. What are some, real world examples of a strong civic identity in action?
Right. To make it more concrete, a strong sense of civic identity is what really inwardly motivates people. It motivates them to volunteer, to help neighbors, or to vote in elections, maybe serve in the military, even pay their taxes to support fellow citizens. It's that deep-seated inner drive, the thing that compels individuals to act beyond just their immediate self-interest, for the collective well-being.
That's a powerful idea, that it motivates these actions rather than them just being like obligations you have to fulfill.
It's an internal commitment.
I remember the source mentioned a quote from someone named Leite suggesting that a strong civic identity can itself motivate citizens to actively participate. So it's not just about obligation, is it? It sounds more like a deep-seated desire.
That's right. It points to that internal commitment. And, we see empirical evidence for this. For instance, the General Social Survey found this really tangible link between pride, which is a key emotional part of civic identity, and actual civic action.
Oh, really? Like what?
Well, 75% of American adults who said they were extremely proud of being American also reported voting in the 1992 election. Now, contrast that with only 64% of those who said they were just somewhat proud.
Wow. Okay. 75 versus 64. That's a noticeable difference.
It is. It really illustrates how this emotional connection translates pretty directly into engagement.
Yeah, that data makes it really clear. Those feelings of pride, connection, they're actual drivers of behavior. This source also suggests something interesting, that without a sense of civic identity, actions like voting or jury duty become, quote, nearly irrational. Why would that be?
Well, think about it. If you analyze these actions purely through the lens of individual gain, right, the immediate personal benefit you get from, say, serving on a jury or casting just one single vote, it can seem tiny.
Okay.
negligible even.
Right. What's in it for me directly?
Exactly. Why bother if there's no direct, tangible benefit to you personally? The source highlights that societies, they kind of recognize this inherent irrationality if you look at it purely from a self-interested perspective.
Ah, okay.
And this is precisely why they developed these, quote, elaborate practices, things like civics classes, national history lessons, specifically to foster this essential mix of emotions, beliefs, and obligations in young people.
So society is trying to build this internal compass.
In a way, yes. They understand that a functional society needs citizens with a collective mindset, not just a collection of purely self-interested individuals.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like we instinctively try to cultivate this for the common good. And looking ahead, it's interesting, this source briefly mentions that civic identity and citizenship have become such common ideas, mainly because of, well, globalization. It sounds like this concept is only becoming more important in our modern world.
Indeed. Globalization has definitely brought in complexities that make understanding civic identity maybe even more urgent. And that's a theme we'll certainly dig into more later.
Okay.
But first, I think it's important we clarify what we even mean by the word identity itself. Because, it's a term that gets used so widely, sometimes quite loosely, in everyday talk.
That's so true. The word identity, it's everywhere, isn't it? It feels like it's almost lost some of its precise meaning sometimes. It can lead to a really wide, kind of diffuse range of interpretations across different fields. How does the source help us make sense of this?
Well, researchers like Brubaker and Cooper, they've highlighted 4 distinct ways identity tends to be used in political discussions. And it's helpful to kind of unpack these to avoid confusion.
Okay, what are they?
So first, it can refer to just a subset of particular interests, like saying, I am a train hobbyist. It identifies a specific passion or a niche interest.
Right, so a hobby or a particular group you belong to based on interest, not necessarily like a core part of who you are in a broader sense.
Exactly. Second, identity is often used to denote group memberships,
Yeah.
things like gender or race identities. This is more about belonging to a larger social category.
Got it.
Third, it can describe a social role that's formed within social or political movements. Think of someone identifying as an activist or perhaps a feminist. It's tied to action and belief within a movement. And finally, number 4, it can indicate a specific aspect of yourself that kind of shifts depending on the social situation or the time. For instance, your identity as a student might be really salient when you're in a classroom, but maybe less so when you're at a family dinner.
That's quite a range of uses, and I can see how they might even seem incompatible at times. Like, the philosophical idea of identity often talks about the persistence of the self over time, right? The enduring qualities that make you, across different situations, different ages.
Continuity.
That seems really different from an aspect of yourself that changes with context, which social psychology often emphasizes.
You've hit on a key tension there. A philosophical identity often looks for that continuity, that permanence.
Yeah.
Whereas in social psychology, identity can be seen as much more transient, much more context-specific. It adapts to different social settings and roles you play.
So, given these different interpretations, who actually gets to decide what someone's identity is? Is it something assigned by others, maybe based on how you look or where you're from? Or is it purely up to the individual's internal sense of self? The source touches on this, doesn't it?
It does, and it's a crucial point. Some scholars do view identity as something assigned by others, often independent of how the individual themselves feels.
Can you give an example?
Sure. An individual of Asian heritage might be labeled Asian by some people, even if they don't personally identify closely with any specific Asian country or culture.
Yeah.
In this view, a theorist might sort of infer the importance from social interaction. They might believe certain characteristics are just so obvious or salient in social contexts that they define an identity, for analytical purposes at least. It's an external label, an attribution.
Okay, that's one perspective, but there's another very different way of looking at it.
Yes, exactly. Other philosophers and psychologists, William James is a famous example, view identity as essentially subjective, meaning it necessarily depends on the individual's own view of themselves.
So it has to come from within.
Right. James, for instance, he saw identity in the continuity of consciousness over time, which is inherently a subjective thing, an internal experience.
Yeah.
From this perspective, a characteristic that might be highly salient to others, maybe gender or race, might be viewed by the individual themselves as actually quite peripheral to their core sense of who they are. And importantly, this subjective perspective, the idea that identity rests on the individual's own view, That's the perspective adopted in the civic identity chapter we're discussing today.
And for those of you listening who are in elementary education or interested in it, this distinction is just so crucial. When we think about the children we work with, are we primarily observing their characteristics, maybe their background, their behavior, and perhaps unintentionally assigning an identity to them based on what we see?
Imposing it.
Or are we really striving to recognize and nurture their own subjective sense of self as it emerges and develops? Understanding this difference helps us approach conversations about self, about groups. In the classroom, with so much more awareness, more sensitivity, it's about respecting their internal world.
It truly does. Recognizing that an individual's self-perception is paramount helps us create environments that genuinely support their identity development rather than, imposing definitions on them from the outside.
So, building on this idea of identity being subjective, let's really dig into how central civic life can become to someone's sense of self. The source says civic identity is a set of beliefs and emotions about oneself as a participant in civic life. And these forms of participation, they can become profoundly associated with your overall identity.
Yes, and the source offers some incredibly powerful, almost emotional anecdotes to illustrate just how deep this personal connection can be.
Like what?
Think about the South African voter, reflecting on the post-apartheid era. They described waiting in line, with both black and white people finally able to vote together. They called it an emotional experience. It wasn't just casting a ballot, right? It was this deeply meaningful act tied to personal history, collective liberation.
Wow. That's a goosebump-inducing example. It really speaks to a profound personal transformation wrapped up in a civic act. And then there's that famous quote attributed to the American Revolutionary War hero Nathan Hale. Just before being hanged as a spy, he reportedly said, "I regret that I have but one life to give for my country." I mean, that just perfectly encapsulates the idea of ultimate sacrifice, driven entirely by a powerful civic identity.
Indeed. And it's not just historical examples either. Researchers also quote an Iraqi citizen talking about the huge risks involved in voting in his country's first democratic election in 50 years. He declared, "Whatever they meaning terrorists would do, I would still vote. Even if I was dead, I would still participate. The vote comes from the bottom of my heart."
That's incredibly moving.
These stories, they powerfully underscore how central civic participation can become to someone's overall identity. It really moves beyond being just a mere duty. It becomes an integral part of who they fundamentally are.
Those are amazing examples showing the real depth of this connection. But it's also important to remember, as the source points out, that the salience, the importance of civic identifications varies a lot.
Definitely.
It's not a uniform experience for everyone, or even across different times in history or different countries.
You're absolutely right. It varies hugely from person to person, across historical eras, and certainly between countries. For instance, there was a poll back in 2004 that showed pride in one's country, which is a component of civic identity varying widely across Europe. Only 23% of Germans reported being very proud of their country, compared to 57% of Spaniards.
That's a huge difference. It really highlights how culture and history must play a massive role.
For sure.
And there's a contemporary concern mentioned too, isn't there? Some researchers worry that the centrality of civic obligations to our sense of self might be declining globally,
Yes, there is that worry.
with potentially worrisome implications for civic participation. If fewer people feel that deep personal connection, it could have serious consequences for democratic engagement, couldn't it?
Precisely. And for you listening, especially if you're working with young minds in a classroom, this variability and this concern are highly relevant. Think about how you actually cultivate a sense of belonging and responsibility in your own classroom. When a student helps a classmate, maybe, or takes real pride in a group project they worked on together, they're tapping into a very early kind of micro version of this civic identity.
That's a great connection. So thinking about that, how can educators intentionally create opportunities for students to feel this emotional connection to their shared classroom community, making participation feel less like, just another chore and more like a core part of who they are in that specific space?
Well, it could be through something as simple, perhaps, as establishing a class constitution or a set of agreed-upon roles where students actually have a voice in shaping them. That fosters a sense of shared ownership, right? Responsibility for their environment.
Yeah, giving them buy-in.
Or maybe implementing something like a classroom cleanup crew where everyone has a designated role, not just to maintain order, but really to instill that feeling of collective contribution to their shared learning space. When a child sees the direct positive impact of their actions on their peers, on their classroom, it helps build that emotional connection.
Right.
They start to feel that being a responsible, contributing member of our class is simply who they are in that setting. It becomes part of their identity there.
So we've explored how deeply personal civic identity can be, but it's also really important to clarify what it's not. The source makes some key distinctions, pointing out that civic identity isn't the same as a purely moral identity or just a national identity.
That's a crucial point to make. Civic identity is typically linked to specific communities and societies that are tied to geographical locations. For instance, thinking of yourself as concerned about your neighborhood or being an active citizen of your town or maybe a proud contributing member of your country, it usually has a local, tangible anchor.
Okay, but then you hear this concept of being a citizen of the world. Doesn't that kind of blur the lines? I know some philosophers debate whether civic identity has to be linked to geography.
Indeed, there is that debate.
Mm.
Proponents of a locale-based identity, people like Michael Walzer, for example, argue that a connection to a specific place and culture is actually necessary for civic action to be motivated and effective.
Why is that?
Without it, they suggest, you just have casual aggregates, basically, groups of individuals acting independently, without cohesive political units capable of governing themselves. You need that shared space and culture for collective action to make sense, they argue.
So the argument goes, if you're not rooted somewhere specific, your civic actions might lack direction or real impact.
That's their line of reasoning. On the other hand, you have theorists like Kymlicka who argue that demands for justice can, and sometimes should, supersede political group boundaries. They suggest that a world citizen might be someone who seeks the widest possible spheres for justice, regardless of location.
Right, like Nelson Mandela. I remember the source mentioning him. After he left the presidency of South Africa, he spoke about seeing his future as part of an international community in pursuit of justice. That sounds like a really powerful example of blurring those lines between local civic goals and maybe more universal moral goals.
It does, and the source certainly acknowledges that complexity. However, the authors of this chapter, Hart and his colleagues, they argue that civic identity is most useful when it is linked to particular social groups located in specific geographical areas.
Why do they take that stance?
In their view, if the idea of civic identity becomes completely unlinked from specific communities and societies, it starts to become really hard to distinguish from just a broad moral orientation or a general moral identity concerned with universal moral issues. They argue there's no real explanatory benefit if civic identity just ends up meaning the same thing as moral identity.
Okay, so it's about maintaining a clear conceptual boundary for the term to be useful. And how does civic identity differ from national identity? You mentioned earlier one can feel, say, fully German and participate in German culture without actively participating in its civic affairs, right?
Exactly. Your civic identity is distinct from your national identity. You can be proud of your country's culture, its history, maybe its sports teams. Those are all aspects of a national identity. But civic identity, as defined here in the source, necessarily implies action in a public arena, an arena governed by a concern with rights and responsibilities for everyone.
So it's about being an active participant.
Yes, an active participant in the functioning of that society, not just identifying with its cultural symbols or history.
This distinction feels really important, especially for those of you in elementary education. How do you teach children to be, good people, which connects to that moral identity, caring about the wider world, while also instilling a sense of active responsibility and participation within their specific classroom or their school or local community? That's the civic identity piece.
It's about layering.
It's about recognizing these different layers of belonging and responsibility without confusing them.
Yeah, think about it this way. Teaching kindness and empathy, that promotes moral development, right? Universal values. But assigning a student the role of line leader or classroom helper, and then explicitly explaining why that role is important for the smooth running of their specific classroom community, that's teaching civic identity. It's about engaging them in the practical, active governance of their immediate shared space.
That's a very clear, practical way to think about it. Now, let's go a bit deeper into how civic identity relates to the broader concept of citizenship. Researchers often define citizenship as having three core qualities: membership, rights, and participation.
Yes, those are often seen as the three pillars. Membership is that sense of belonging to a nation and its communities. Rights are the entitlements you get by virtue of that membership, and participation means actively shaping those rights and engaging in the life of the society. True, full citizenship really requires that active participation piece.
So it's not enough just to be physically in a country. You have to feel like you belong, know you have rights, and then act on them, engage. The source makes a strong point here that participation in democratic government relies on some degree of subjective identification with other citizens and with the state's institutions.
It does. Democracy, arguably, functions best when elected officials actually feel concern for their constituents' well-being and for the state itself. They often need to subjugate their own private interests for the public good. That's why we have laws and regulations, right? To try and diminish the inclination for government officials to pursue private goals at the expense of the public.
And this applies to citizens too, not just officials, doesn't it? The source uses a very vivid example to make this concrete. It talks about the idea of allowing, say, an Australian resident to vote or run for office in local elections within the United States. Why would that seem unwise?
Well, because, as the source suggests, they presumably have no real vested interest in the governance of, let's say, Cheyenne, Wyoming. Their decisions might be ill-informed about local needs, or maybe even aimed at benefiting their home country rather than that local community. This really highlights why that sense of identification with the local community is seen as a prerequisite for effective citizenship and a healthy democracy. It helps ensure citizens are invested in their own community's success.
It's about having aligned interests and genuine investment, skin in the game, so to speak. So when civic life gets reduced to just instrumental action intended to fulfill purely selfish interests, the source concludes that's incompatible with healthy democracy.
Exactly. Now, while it's probably true that not every single citizen identifies deeply all the time, a society where civic life is purely transactional, purely what's in it for me, that's not the ideal we should strive for. So a full civic identity, then, it contains elements of membership, like a national identity, that feeling of, I'm Canadian. It includes concerns for rights, which links to moral identity, that sense of, I'm a citizen of the world. And critically, it motivates, is maintained, and is structured by participation in civic life. It's the active engagement piece that really brings it all together and defines it.
This is incredibly practical for thinking about the classroom environment. As an educator, you can think about these three pillars. Do students feel a real sense of membership in their class community?
Yeah, do they feel like they belong?
Do they understand their rights, like having your voice heard or feeling safe, and also their responsibilities, like listening respectfully to others or contributing to a positive learning atmosphere? And maybe most importantly, how do you encourage their active participation in shaping these aspects of their shared space? These are really the foundational practices of citizenship, just distilled down to that micro-level classroom environment.
Absolutely. Having a classroom meeting where students get to vote on a new class activity, or where they maybe collectively problem solve a classroom issue that actively involves them in all three pillars. They feel membership, they exercise their right to have a voice, and they participate in decision-making. It's citizenship in practice.
That leads us perfectly into the next big question, the developmental aspect. How does civic identity actually emerge and evolve over time? The source suggests it's maybe less stable than some other identities, like, say, sexual identity, and that it's more open to psychological, social, and political influences.
Yes, it seems to be quite fluid, quite malleable. For example, the source mentions the 2008 U.S. presidential election with Barack Obama as a candidate. That election was thought to really enlarge and energize the civic identities of many voters who maybe previously felt disconnected from civic and political concerns.
Right.
That election clearly demonstrates how major political events can significantly reshape an individual's civic identity, bring new people into the fold, or change how existing participants feel.
That makes sense. Big external events can definitely activate or change our sense of self in civic life. The source also points out that the different facets of civic identity, remember, membership, rights, and participation, they likely follow partially independent developmental trajectories. So they might develop at different rates, maybe influenced by different things along the way.
Exactly. And here's where it gets really interesting, especially for those of you focused on elementary education. The research suggests that both the sense of membership and the understanding of rights seem to emerge at very young ages.
Really? That early?
Yes, this is a key insight. You are definitely not starting from a blank slate when you're working with young children in this area.
That's quite surprising. Tell us more about the early emergence of membership. What does the research actually say?
Well, studies have shown that English school children, as young as 5 years old, were already able to distinguish between British citizens and people from, say, America and Germany.
Wow, at 5?
Yes. And not only that, but even these young children apparently preferred citizens of their own nations to those of others, demonstrating a kind of early in-group preference. What's more, the importance they placed on national identity actually increased over the course of childhood. Older children judged nationality as being more important than identities based on gender or age. Now, there is some variation in research across different countries and methods, so the exact developmental trajectories aren't fully mapped out yet. But the general trend points to this early emergence of national group identification.
So that sense of us versus them, at least in a national context, starts forming incredibly early.
Yeah.
What about rights? Do young children grasp concepts like rights and fairness intuitively, too?
They absolutely do, and this is perhaps even more compelling. A whole series of studies, mainly by Elliot Turiel, Charles Hellwig, and their colleagues, show that children and adolescents believe citizens have fundamental rights that should not be violated through governmental actions.
Oh.
And here's a really compelling detail. In studies conducted in Canada, the United States, and even China, which is often seen as less traditionally rights-oriented children as young as 6 years old, were shown to judge, based on principles of fairness, that citizens should not be prevented by legislation or authority from criticizing the government.
6-year-olds arguing for freedom of speech, that's truly remarkable. They seem to instinctively grasp this idea of fundamental rights and fairness, even without formal civics lessons.
It suggests a fundamental sensitivity to rights emerges remarkably early in life. Now, older children's judgments about rights do become more differentiated, more pragmatic, taking context into account more. But the core sensitivity appears very early and, surprisingly, across quite diverse cultural contexts.
Okay, so membership and rights emerge early. What about participation, becoming a civic actor?
Less is known about children's direct sense of themselves in that role specifically. But volunteering is widely recognized as an important precursor to adult civic participation. And we know that by adolescence, volunteering activities can become viewed by young people as really integral to their sense of self, part of who they are.
This whole developmental aspect offers such profound insights for anyone working with young children. It really highlights that even at elementary school age, kids are already developing fundamental aspects of civic identity, that sense of belonging to a group, and that intuitive understanding of rights and fairness. As you said, you're not starting from scratch.
Not at all.
So how can educators really capitalize on this? What are some practical ways to reinforce these early emerging senses right there in the classroom?
Well, for fostering that sense of membership, simple things can be really effective. Creating a class motto, maybe, or a unique class handshake, builds that shared identity. Having students take turns being class leader for the day gives them a sense of shared responsibility and belonging to the group that leads. And encouraging teamwork on projects, that really helps them feel a shared identity as our class working towards a common goal.
Okay, that makes sense for membership. What about reinforcing that early sense of rights and fairness?
Well, discussions about why classroom rules exist, framing them around fairness, and keeping everyone safe and able to learn. Talking about what's fair or unfair in playground disputes, maybe, or holding mini-class debates where the focus is on everyone having a right to express their opinion respectfully. These are all practical ways to reinforce that early sensitivity. It helps them internalize the concepts.
Right, making abstract ideas concrete through their own experience.
Exactly. And then for encouraging participation, assigning classroom jobs is a classic example. Having students vote on a class activity, like what book to read next, or encouraging them to volunteer to help clean up or assist a peer who needs help. These aren't just classroom management techniques. They are small, tangible actions that lay the groundwork for future civic engagement. They make participation feel like a natural, expected part of being in that shade space.
So we've covered what civic identity is, how it connects to the self, how it differs from other identities, and how it starts to emerge in childhood. But the world is constantly changing, right? And the source makes it very clear that civic identity and citizenship have become really central topics lately due to these big transformations in social, economic, and political life, which we often lump together under the term globalization.
That's right. And to illustrate just how intertwined these concepts have become in academic and public discussion, the source cites a pretty stark data point.
What's that?
In 1990, only about 4% of academic articles using the keyword citizenship also contained the word globalization. But by 2008, that number had jumped dramatically to 45%.
Wow, 4% to 45% in less than 2 decades. That's a massive shift.
It really shows the increasing recognition of how global forces are impacting our sense of local and national belonging and raising questions about citizenship.
And one of the primary drivers behind this increased interest, mentioned prominently in the source, is immigration.
Precisely. Immigration raises these profound questions, not just about legal rights and responsibilities, but deeply about identities. As the source notes, simply residing in a country is often not sufficient to ensure identification with it.
Right. You can be physically present, but not feel that sense of connection or belonging. The source gives an example from Sweden, I think.
Yes. It mentions research suggesting some immigrants to Sweden might accept welfare benefits but still fail to perceive themselves to be Swedish or Swedish-like. And this lack of identification might be reflected, for example, in an unwillingness to acquire the language or adopt common practices, as one researcher observed.
That's a practical illustration of the complex challenges immigration can pose for civic identity, both for the immigrants and the host society. The source also brings up the arguments of Samuel Huntington from his 2004 book, which were, well, quite controversial at the time. It's important we report these neutrally, just as the source does.
Absolutely. Huntington argued, and again we're just reporting his viewpoint here, that recent Mexican immigrants to the United States might not incorporate key elements of American national identity into their belief systems. This, he suggested, could lead to a lack of identification as Americans regarding what he saw as core American values. He cited several reasons for this concern.
And what were those reasons Huntington put forward, according to the source?
First, he suggested that Mexico's geographical closeness to the U.S. allows immigrants to more easily maintain social ties and institutional affiliations back home, potentially reducing the likelihood of developing strong new affiliations in the U.S.
Okay.
Second, Huntington argued that the large size of the Mexican immigrant community in the U.S. allows for strong bonding within the group, rather than necessarily fostering relationships with other Americans who might model what he considered traditional values.
And Huntington foresaw some pretty significant, or as he put it, dangerous consequences from this trend, didn't he?
He did. He suggested, and again, this is his stated concern, that the continuation of this large immigration without improved assimilation could divide the United States into a country of two languages and two cultures. He felt this could result in the end of the America we have known for more than 3 centuries. It's important to note, as the source does, that similar concerns about assimilation and national identity have been raised by commentators in other Western democracies facing large-scale immigration.
So it's a complex and often sensitive debate about how different identities coexist or integrate within a single national framework. And beyond immigration of people from other countries, increasing ethnic and racial diversity among citizens already within a country also poses some related challenges, according to some researchers mentioned.
Yes. Researchers like Robert Putnam, for instance, have reported findings suggesting that increasing racial and ethnic diversity in many Western democracies is often accompanied by decreases in social capital.
Can you quickly remind us what social capital means in this context?
Sure. Social capital is generally defined as the value inherent in social networks, characterized by things like reciprocity and trustworthiness. It's basically the strength of the bonds and the level of trust within a community. Putnam found that diversity can sometimes lead to a decrease in this social capital.
And why might that be?
Well, one potential reason suggested is that citizens of different races and ethnicities might sometimes view themselves as being in competition with each other for limited resources. This perception, whether accurate or not, could potentially lead to increased in-group bias and maybe derogation of out-groups, even in countries typically seen as quite tolerant, like the Nordic nations.
So diversity, while often celebrated for its richness and benefits, can also present challenges to social cohesion and, by extension, perhaps civic identity, according to this line of research. Another researcher mentioned, Paul Collier, even suggested that many governance problems in some of the world's poorest nations might actually result from high levels of ethnic diversity.
Yes. Collier attributed issues like corruption and inequitable resource distribution in some poorly functioning African states, partly to ethnic diversity. His argument was that in some places, people's primary allegiance was to their ethnic group, rather than to a shared national loyalty. He went so far as to suggest that overcoming this requires deliberate efforts to gradually erode ethnic identities and replace them with a national identity.
Wow, that's a very strong position advocating for assimilation. But Collier also notes something else, right? That high levels of ethnic identification in some African countries are actually positively related to things like educational attainment and political mobilization.
Exactly, which implies that these ethnic identities are strong, perhaps beneficial in some ways, and unlikely to disappear as a result of modernization. It points to the real complexity of the situation.
It certainly does.
And Collier also describes research suggesting that civic identity might be particularly submerged or weak in countries that have high levels of both poverty and diversity. In those nations, the absence of a strong, shared collective identity can apparently exacerbate conflicts that arise from resource shortages.
It sounds like a really thorny issue with profound implications, but this source wisely concludes this section by acknowledging the complexity, right? It notes that studies in intergroup relations within psychology suggest that the implications of diversity and immigration are very complex and can actually be beneficial in certain contexts. It's clearly not a simple black and white picture.
Not at all. And for you, thinking as an elementary educator, this aspect can feel very real in the microcosm of a classroom, especially in diverse communities. How do you, as an educator, navigate these larger societal debates in miniature?
Yeah, that's the challenge.
How can you foster a sense of shared classroom citizenship among students who come from incredibly diverse backgrounds, ensuring that all of them feel that sense of belonging and responsibility without diminishing their unique cultural and ethnic identities?
It's about building bridges, isn't it? Finding that common purpose within the diversity. Maybe it's explicitly emphasizing that while we celebrate all our different backgrounds here in this classroom, we are all one community. We have shared goals, shared responsibilities. It's definitely challenging, but really crucial work.
Absolutely.
So shifting gears slightly, what actually drives this multifaceted civic identity? Let's explore the different contexts and influences, psychological, political, demographic, that shape it. Starting with psychological influences, the source highlights trust as being absolutely fundamental.
Yes, trust, that basic expectation that other people are generally fair, trustworthy, and likely to reciprocate cooperation, is considered the cornerstone of the psychological foundation of citizenship, as one researcher put it.
The cornerstone, wow.
Yeah. And the data backs it up. Adults who score high on measures of trust tend to participate in civic life to a much greater degree than those who lack trust. And similarly, adolescents who report high levels of trust also report more conventional civic engagement and, importantly, intend to participate more as adults.
So trust directly fuels civic participation. It also seems likely, then, that trust increases your propensity to identify with others, to feel connected, and maybe to have more interest in rights and responsibilities.
If you trust the system and the people in it, you're probably more likely to feel a part of it and care about how it functions.
Exactly right. Then there's the factor of civic knowledge, knowing about democratic principles, history, how government works. This is widely considered important. And it is associated with political participation and respect for rights. This is, after all, a big reason why we have civics curricula in schools. But, and this seems like a really crucial insight, especially for educators, the source points out that the assumption that those who know more will automatically translate that knowledge into action is not as well substantiated as many proponents of civics education imagine. That's a pretty significant finding.
It really is. It challenges a long-held, kind of intuitive belief in education. Simply teaching facts about government or history doesn't automatically create active, engaged citizens. There seems to be something else, or maybe something more, at play.
So what else is there psychologically?
Another key psychological factor mentioned is the fundamental need to belong. We know from research on peer relations that this is a primary motivator for humans. It can even lead individuals to accept negative behavior if it's seen as a group norm, just to fit in. It's likely that individuals also feel a similar powerful need to belong to a nation, even starting in childhood, as we discussed earlier.
Okay, this psychological piece feels like one of the most powerful insights for those of you working with young children in elementary education. While we might instinctively focus on teaching civic facts, the names of the branches of government, important historical dates, this research strongly suggests that fostering trust within your classroom environment, creating a space where children feel secure, where they feel they can trust their peers and trust you, that might actually be more impactful for building their future civic identity than simply imparting knowledge.
And similarly, nurturing that strong sense of belonging to the classroom community is vital. How do you create those opportunities for children to observe and actually participate in fair processes right there in their daily school life? That's how you build their trust in institutions, starting at that micro level.
Can you give an example?
Sure, it could be as simple as having really consistent and transparent classroom rules that everyone understands, fair distribution of desirable classroom jobs, or even carefully mediated conflict resolution between students, where they see a fair process in action, maybe even participate in finding a solution. That builds trust in the system of the classroom.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, let's turn our attention to political influences. Civic identity is also clearly shaped by the broader political climate, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It's expressed very differently in societies characterized by repression compared to those that are open to dissent and activism. Importantly, the absence of explicit activism doesn't necessarily mean people are satisfied. It might simply reflect the danger involved in expressing opposition.
Right. And here's another paradox that emerged from one study mentioned in the source. Political efficacy. That's the sense of being an effective actor in the political sphere. Feeling like your actions matter was actually found to be lower in countries with more political rights and civil liberties.
Yeah, that was really counterintuitive, isn't it?
It really is. In places where you'd think people would feel more empowered because they have more freedom, they actually reported feeling less effective. What might possibly explain that?
It's a fascinating finding, and the source doesn't give a definitive answer, but it certainly sparks further thought. Perhaps in societies with more established political rights, the sheer volume of voices, the complexity of the political landscape, maybe the bureaucracy, it could make individuals feel like their single voice actually matters less, or that achieving real change is incredibly difficult, despite the freedom to speak out. It could be that the very freedom to dissent also constantly highlights the difficulty of achieving consensus or making systemic change. It's a puzzle.
It definitely is. Lastly, let's look at demographic influences on civic identity. Things like economic conditions.
Right. The source notes that poor economic times may adversely affect civic identity in multiple ways. It's generally assumed that when people are struggling economically, maybe focused on basic survival, it becomes more difficult to cultivate civic identity and encourage participation in collective civic action.
That seems logical, and we touched on this earlier. Ethnic heterogeneity or diversity. It's often assumed by some scholars to interfere with citizenship, making it harder to create social capital and broad national identification.
That's a common argument cited in the literature, yes. But a particularly interesting demographic factor the source discusses is something called child saturation.
Child saturation, what does that mean?
It refers to the percentage of a country's population that is composed of children under the age of 15. Basically, how young the population is overall.
Okay. And how does that demographic factor influence civic identity or society?
Well, historically, high levels of child saturation, sometimes called youth bulges, have been linked by some historians and sociologists to major historical events, things like the Protestant Reformation, the revolutions in 18th century France, even 20th century Indonesia.
Wow, really?
The reasoning offered is that youth are often less invested in existing social structures. They're less likely to be married, have children, own property, or hold prestigious positions. Therefore, they may be more open to joining movements that seek to overthrow or radically revise existing orthodoxies and power structures.
That's a powerful connection between demographics and potential societal upheaval. And in terms of civic identity development specifically, what did the research find?
Some research found that young people growing up in these child-saturated communities tend to be less influenced by adults and also tend to have less civic knowledge compared to those growing up in more adult-saturated contexts.
Why would that be?
The theory is fairly straightforward. There are simply fewer adults available per child to transmit cultural information, societal norms, and specific civic knowledge in these highly youth-populated environments. Researchers even demonstrated empirically that children in child-saturated communities and countries do tend to have lower scores on civic knowledge tests.
Interesting. And did the researchers speculate on the outcomes of this?
They did. The authors suggested, though they stressed this hasn't been empirically proven yet, that youth with little civic knowledge might potentially be more prone to radical political and social activism. They also raised the interesting and perhaps provocative question of whether specific types of civic identities might even be involved in motivating terrorist activities. But again, that was speculation.
Okay.
This demographic concept of child saturation, it has some intriguing implications when you think about the school environment, doesn't it? Consider the community your students live in. Is it child-saturated or adult-saturated? The source suggests this ratio can subtly influence how deeply civic knowledge and cultural information get transmitted, which means the broader demographics of your community might be shaping how children develop their civic identity, maybe affecting how much they absorb from adult role models versus how much they absorb from their peer group. It definitely shifts the dynamics of socialization and information transmission. It might make the teacher's role even more critical in deliberately fostering civic engagement and knowledge within the specific context of the classroom, perhaps compensating for fewer adult influences elsewhere.
That's a really interesting point. Now, to bring a lot of these threads together with some really robust data, let's turn to a major international study mentioned in the source. The International Association for the Evaluation of Educational Achievement, or IEA, Civic Education Study. It's often known just as CIV.
Yes, the CIV study was a really significant piece of research. It was a rigorous international survey involving 14-year-old adolescents across 28 different countries.
28 countries, that's a huge scope.
It really was. It spanned Europe, Asia, Latin America, the US, Australia, and the total sample size was massive, nearly 90,000 adolescents. So it gives us a really reliable data set to look at.
And what did they assess in these 90,000 teenagers?
The adolescents completed surveys covering their civic attitudes, their anticipated future civic participation, and they also took a 38-item civic knowledge assessment test.
What makes this study particularly valuable is its international scope, right? It allowed researchers to actually examine associations between country-level characteristics, demographic, political, and the individual civic identities of the teenagers within those countries.
Exactly. That's its unique advantage. It could look at both individual factors and the broader context simultaneously. The CIBE study included indicators designed to capture those three core qualities of citizenship and civic identity we've been discussing: membership, participation, and rights.
Okay, how did they measure those?
Well, membership was assessed partly through agreement with statements like, "This country should be proud of what it has achieved." This served as an indicator of nationalism and a general sense of belonging.
Right, so measuring how proud the young people felt about their country. And what about participation?
Conventional participation was measured by asking them to judge the importance of actions like voting in every election. And support for rights was indicated by their agreement with statements such as, "Women should have all the same rights as men in every way."
Got it. And they also looked at attitudes towards immigration.
Yes, the study included an 8-item attitudinal measure concerning immigration, where higher scores indicated a more favorable attitude towards immigrants and their rights.
Okay, so those are the outcomes they measured. What kinds of predictors did they look at, both at the individual student level and the country level?
At the individual level, they examined factors like the student's civic knowledge score and their level of political trust. At the country level, they included measures like the country's rating on voice and accountability, which basically indexed tolerance for political dissent. The level of child saturation we just discussed, the country's per capita gross domestic product, GDP, as a measure of affluence, and its level of ethnic diversity.
Okay, so they looked at a lot of variables. With all this data, what were the crucial findings from the CIVV study, and what are the big implications, especially for those of you thinking about education?
Well, probably the most striking general observation, and perhaps quite surprising, is that the correlations among the different indicators of civic identity nationalism, conventional participation, and support for women's rights were generally small in magnitude.
Small, meaning they weren't strongly related.
Exactly. They were only weakly related to each other. This suggests that these are actually quite distinct, loosely connected aspects of civic identity, rather than being tightly integrated components that all move together.
That's a really significant finding in itself. It means someone can feel a strong sense of national pride, for example, but not necessarily prioritize conventional participation like voting or strongly support gender equality rights, or vice versa. They're not as linked as maybe we intuitively assume.
Precisely.
What about nationalism specifically? How did it relate to other factors in the study?
Nationalism was positively correlated with both conventional participation and support for women's rights. So adolescents who strongly identified with their countries were, on average, more likely to say things like jury duty and voting are important, and also more likely to support women's full participation in society. Nationalism was also positively related to trust. Adolescents who trusted their political institutions tended to be more patriotic.
Right, those connections seem fairly intuitive. But then there's the real aha moment for educators, isn't there? The finding that really challenges traditional assumptions about civics class.
Yes. Critically, this study found that nationalism was essentially unrelated to civic knowledge.
Unrelated. So knowing more didn't mean feeling more patriotic.
Basically, yes. This is a profound finding, and perhaps surprising for many involved in education. It directly challenges that common assumption that simply teaching facts about civics will directly build patriotism or a strong sense of national belonging. According to this large study, adolescents with very little understanding of how democratic governments actually work identified with their countries just as strongly as those who had sophisticated understandings.
So knowing the details of government doesn't necessarily make you feel more patriotic or make you feel like you belong more strongly. That is a huge takeaway. What about the country-level correlations? What broad patterns emerge there for these different indicators?
Okay, looking at the country level, in broad strokes, nationalism tended to be higher in countries with higher child saturation, so countries with younger populations. Interestingly, it was inversely correlated with ethnic diversity and also, surprisingly perhaps, with per capita GDP. Adolescents in more affluent countries actually reported lower levels of nationalism.
That's a lot to unpack there. So generally speaking, this suggests countries that were poorer, younger, and more ethnically homogenous tended to have higher nationalism among their 14-year-olds.
That's what the correlation pattern suggests, yes. Now, for conventional participation, it was higher among adolescents who reported high levels of trust, and also higher in countries with high child saturation. But interestingly, it was lower in countries with high per capita GDP and in countries where political dissent or voice was more common.
So again, in countries with more freedom to voice dissent and greater affluence, young people were actually less likely to endorse conventional participation like voting. That's another one of those paradoxes similar to the political efficacy finding we discussed earlier.
It is indeed. And finally, support for women's rights.
Yeah.
This was highest among adolescents who had high trust, who scored high on civic knowledge, and who lived in countries that were supportive of political dissent, were relatively affluent, and were more ethnically homogeneous.
Okay, so those factors seem to align a bit more with what we might intuitively expect to correlate with progressive social attitudes like gender equality. So pulling all these CIVD findings together, what's the core message for civic education, the big takeaway that the study reinforces?
I think the core message is this. The overall pattern of correlations from the CIVD study indicates that civic identity rests upon trust in political institutions to a much greater degree than it does upon civic knowledge.
Wow, let that sink in. Trust matters more than knowledge for building civic identity.
That's what this data strongly suggests. Many societies, many school systems, try to instill civic spirit, primarily through civics instruction, teaching facts, history, structures. However, these findings powerfully suggest that the social context and developing positive attitudes like trust may actually be far more important for educators who are interested in influencing civic spirit.
So this implies that preparing future citizens might be more effective if the focus shifts towards providing adolescents with actual experiences where they can observe and participate in effective, fair political processes, even at a school or community level, thereby fostering trust in institutions through practice.
Exactly. It's less about just what they know and more about what they experience and how they feel as a result of those experiences. The findings indicate that civic knowledge, at least in this large study of 14-year-olds, was largely independent of their core civic identity feelings, like nationalism or inclination to participate conventionally.
Now, this doesn't mean knowledge is unimportant overall, right?
Of course not. Knowledge is crucial for informed participation, but it might not be the primary driver of identity formation itself. The study also suggests that elements of civic identity can sometimes be in a kind of dynamic tension. Factors that enhance one element, like political voice, may be leading to more support for women's rights, might simultaneously depress another element, like maybe nationalism. It points to a really complex interplay that educators and policymakers need to consider.
That's a lot to think about, but let's look at one more really intriguing finding from the CIV study before we wrap up. The relationship between civic identity and attitudes toward immigration.
Yes, this was quite interesting. Intriguingly, all three indicators of civic identity that they measured, nationalism, conventional participation, and support for women's rights, were positively associated with having favorable attitudes about immigrants.
Wait, all three? Even nationalism? That seems to run counter to some of the earlier points we discussed about diversity potentially leading to competition or in-group bias. How does that work?
Well, the study revealed a fascinating nonlinear relationship. particularly for nationalism. It wasn't a straight line.
Okay. What did the curve look like?
At low to average levels of nationalism within a country, there was very little change in positive attitudes toward immigrants. However, as countries moved from average levels of nationalism to high levels of nationalism, the average positive attitude toward immigrants became sharply more positive.
Sharply more positive at high levels of nationalism. That is really counterintuitive for many people, I think. What does that suggest about the nuances of patriotism and openness?
It's complex, but one possible interpretation offered is that perhaps at very high levels of national identification and pride, adolescents feel more confident. Confident that their countries are able to assimilate immigrants and accommodate to cultural traditions immigrants bring with them. It suggests maybe a strong, secure national identity doesn't automatically lead to exclusion, but can, perhaps paradoxically, foster a greater sense of confidence in the nation's capacity for integration and openness.
That offers a much more nuanced perspective on patriotism and attitudes towards newcomers than we often hear. Okay, we've covered a huge amount of ground in this deep dive, so let's try to summarize. What does this extensive exploration of civic identity really mean for you, our listener? Whether you're shaping young minds in the classroom or maybe just striving to be a more informed and engaged citizen yourself.
Well, firstly, I think it's crucial to remember that civic identity isn't just one thing. It's multifaceted, it's subjective based on your own feelings, and it's dynamic. It changes, it encompasses your sense of belonging, your actual participation, and your understanding of rights and responsibilities within a community. And it's constantly being shaped by both internal feelings and external forces.
Okay, multifaceted, subjective, dynamic. Got it. Secondly, and this is just so important for anyone working with young children, the seeds of civic identity are sown incredibly early. Even very young kids show an innate sense of group membership, of fairness. These are foundations you can actively build upon every single day in an educational setting. You're not starting from scratch, you're nurturing something that's already beginning to sprout.
Absolutely. Thirdly, we've seen how these big, broader societal forces, globalization, immigration, diversity, intensely shape civic identity today. They present both profound challenges, as we discussed with competition or assimilation concerns, but also complex opportunities for how individuals connect with their shared societies. It's a dynamic interplay that educators especially have to navigate thoughtfully.
Right. And perhaps the most crucial takeaway, especially for you in elementary education, while civic knowledge certainly has its place, this body of research powerfully suggests that fostering trust within the learning environment and creating consistent opportunities for fair, meaningful participation might be far more impactful for cultivating a robust, lasting civic identity than simply having students memorize facts about government. It really emphasizes doing civics, experiencing it, not just knowing about it abstractly.
It definitely shifts the emphasis, doesn't it? From maybe rote learning towards more experiential learning, helping children develop that deep emotional connection to their roles as members and contributors within their immediate communities, starting right there in the classroom.
So this leaves us with a really compelling question to ponder, doesn't it? If we truly want to nurture the next generation of actively engaged, responsible citizens, how do we maybe pivot our educational approach? How do we prioritize creating environments where trust can genuinely flourish, where every child feels an undeniable sense of belonging, and where they can actually practice the vital responsibilities of community membership in tangible ways every single day?
Yeah, what does that look like in practice?
What small changes might you consider in your own classroom or even in your home to build that deep, trust-based connection to civic life, starting right now?
It really is about designing those experiences, those opportunities that make civic engagement feel real, relevant, and intrinsically rewarding right from a young age.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the complex world of civic identity. We really hope this exploration has given you some new insights, maybe some practical ideas, and perhaps even a fresh perspective on the profound connections between our individual sense of self and the larger civic fabric we're all a part of.